Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today we will discuss how science fiction can be used as a tool in international relations and global politics. This episode is part of our Summer 2023 special series, Read with Bruegel. In this series, we have the pleasure of hosting authors who discuss various issues based on their insightful books, often linked to economic issues. I hope these conversations will inspire you to explore their books and offer you some food for thought during your summer break. Joining me today is Laura Horn and Isabella Herman, with whom I've been involved in the writing of the Palgrave Handbook of Global Politics in the 22nd Century. Laura is Associate Professor in the Department of Social Sciences and Business at the Roskilde University in Denmark, and Isabella Herman holds a PhD in International Relations and works as a science fiction analyst, and she's based in Berlin. Laura, Isabella, welcome to The Sound of Economics.
Hi, Giuseppe.
Thank you so much for having us on the podcast.
The Palgrave Handbook of Global Politics in the 22nd Century is an edited collection of essays offering a visionary exploration that dares to write the future of global politics. Drawing from a diverse array of theoretical perspectives and approaches, this groundbreaking work establishes an entirely new field of academic science fiction. Written in a futur antérieur style, the handbook skillfully mirrors the format and style of existing handbooks, providing readers with a familiar yet captivating reading experience. With a total of 24 thought-provoking chapters, including an engaging editorial introduction and conclusion, this handbook delves into a wide range of themes and concepts which are fundamental for global politics and international relations at the moment. Laura, you are one of the editors of the volume, and perhaps you can kick off by telling us how did the project started and why?
Thank you, Giuseppe. This book project is one of those projects that have taken a long time to come to fruition, but at the same time are immensely enjoyable and just a wonderful example of what academia and academic collaboration can mean. Together with my other co-editors, Franziska Müller of Hamburg University and Aisha Mert of the Stockholm Universities, we've created a community of scholars that, on the one hand, have an interest in science fiction and narratives and imaginaries of the future, and at the same time wanted to go beyond the academic obsession with science fiction that you find in many disciplines. In a way, we bring together lots of different objectives in this one book. Many of us, in particular the ones who are very squarely based in international relations as a discipline, have been engaging in science fiction analysis, engagement with popular culture, both in political science and international relations, where you find roughly from the 2000 onwards, people start looking at popular culture as manifestation of contemporary threats and fears, for instance, but also alternatives and utopias, dystopias of alternative politics. Some of that is perhaps also what someone has called a fan fiction by proxy element, where, I really like Battlestar Galactica, so I'm going to watch the show and sort of link it up with contemporary US politics. And that is a very interesting way and a very accessible way to write international relations analysis. And it's also something that popular readers or non-academic readers, in particular also in policy, find very intuitive. But on some level, that all stays at the level of engagement with material that's out there, almost literary analysis, if you want. But then there's a counter trend that we have seen over the last, let's say, decade or so, where the future itself has become a contested frame of reference to the extent that we see a massive increase in using foresight, forecasting, future-making methods, also backcasting from all sorts of institutional, but also civil society actors where you see that there is a need for thinking about how do we think about the future? Do we think that the future is a linear extrapolation of where we are right now? Do we allow for multiple futures? Do we allow for an understanding of the future as something that is not yet foreclosed, that is really an open horizon? We cannot just impose or superimpose our own assumptions into it. So these two dimensions led us to engage with thinking possible global futures in ways that were really open-ended and non-linear, which is something that you often don't find in the discipline.
Thank you, Laura. And Isabella, you wrote one of the chapters of this book, and we have started and shared this intellectual and creative process because for the records and our listeners, you will find also a chapter from myself in this book. But following up on Laura's thoughts, I would like to ask you, what did you learn along the way in this process?
Yeah, thank you, Giuseppe. I mean, funny enough, right? I'm analyzing actually science fiction. So I'm not writing science fiction myself normally. Now I did. And analyzing is in fact easier than constructively doing something yourself, right? And then if you also say like, I don't want to do it in a dystopian way, or I do want to make it a bit more constructively, it's really difficult. So this was actually the first learning process, right? To see how really difficult it is to actually try to do what you are normally criticizing. So criticizing is, as a social scientist or a political scientist, a lot more easier. So I think in the process, and this is what we also shared, that our ideas have grown and then became something else. So my idea at the beginning was really different. And through the workshop processes we had, I mean, that for our audience, right? We had a lot of workshops, discussion and exchange to develop those stories. And then they have become something else. And this was quite interesting to also reflect for oneself. What is actually my take on international relations? How do I see the discipline? What do I think as an individual for myself? Why am I actually doing political science? Why am I so fascinated by it? And I think for each of us, this was a self-finding process also. But as a reader of the book, you see the result, you don't have to take part in this whole process, but you see the result of that. And this is what makes it very readable also. So yeah, I'd say it was a self-finding process, and then you have the discussion with the others to reflect, what you're thinking. So I think, yeah, in many ways, on many levels, many perspectives, it was really a very, very fruitful undertaking.
And speaking about the results, I would like to go a little bit more in depth into the actual book and its content. Laura, what are the core assumptions and the conceptual frames which have been developed in the book? If you can give us a little bit of a glimpse.
Sure. The book, if you wanted to boil it down, is a future anterior perspective on the last 100 years of global politics seen from the vantage point of the year 2122. If you now think future anterior, what is that? It's actually a fairly common science fiction angle, so to speak, that, you look backwards, as the famous Edward Bellamy book also did. We're developing future histories, and we're allowing ourselves that critical distance from these histories to take on the social scientific perspective of looking at actors and processes and structures, institutions evolving. What we do is we also, at the same time as we write those chapters, we challenge some of the assumptions that we seem to have in academia, in our discipline, in international relations and political science, but also in society more largely, that, for instance, universities and systems of knowledge production will still be, first of all, will still be around in 100 years, but will also be resembling what they look like now. So there will still be books, there will still be people and students being interested in global politics. Global politics will still be a thing. That's, of course, that's something that's very interesting, and that's something that's kind of fundamental for us in writing these stories. And then at the same time, again, we kind of question them. So it becomes almost a dialectic exercise, this whole book. The conceptual frame, or one of the core dimensions, also hinges on a multiverse perspective. The multiverse is, of course, an idea that has been explored in many, many different both academic areas and disciplines, but also in popular imaginaries. Our multiverse is very much inspired by Ted Chiang's science fiction work, in particular a novella in the wonderful 2019 Exhalations book, Anxiety is the Dizziness of Freedom, where he has a multiverse perspective that hinges on a sort of quantum apparatus. And we basically ask, what if we can make that possible? And we explore global politics, not just in linearity, but also sideways. Other sort of conceptual core assumptions are the question of time and how we experience time, how we think about time, and how we think ourselves into the time frame that we have. There's something here about the near future that we often see in, for instance, policymaking and foresight, where, you know, we have the next plan to be carbon neutral or net zero by 2050. We want this by, and so forth and so forth. And in particular, in the climate and ecological emergency, that becomes more and more tangible and important, of course. But what if we see ourselves in a time frame that would say the 2 generations before us and the 2 generations that come after us, right? So the kind of time frame that we can still feel effective emotional resonance with, the kind of my child's child. How will, you know, global politics look like then? It has a very different resonance with you as the writer. And this is where we come back to Isabella's point, that it is so much more difficult to write science fiction than it is academic prose. And that's maybe one of the last assumptions I would like to, or conceptual frames that I would like to bring in here. What we realized in the collective process of writing this book is that academic writing comes in so many different genres. It's a wonderful, fantastic, beautiful ecology that goes way beyond just the book or the journal article. So we have this fantastic spectrum of ways in which academic work takes place that you can find in the book. And it really goes to show that our assumptions about academia really need to be rethought, because the way analysis can be brought in, the way argumentation and engagement with data, whether it's fictive or real, can be so much more than just the kind of fetishization of journal articles.
Isabella, in your chapter, speaking of what Laura tells us on the conceptual level, like bringing it down to the actual storytelling, you create a scenario which plays around the concept of utopia and dystopia. I would say not only mixing them up, but trying to overcome those concepts. What is the global politics future that you describe, and which kind of challenges it poses?
It is quite interesting because I didn't write this story intentional to be as it is, right? I was writing it because it was a development, and then, you know, I had a path, and then in the end, there was this result as a story. And normally I'm analyzing science fiction, so it was quite funny afterwards to analyze for myself, what did I actually write there? And to have this distance, right? And then I realized that the story itself quite reflects what I'm actually thinking about utopias and dystopias. So it was, a bit of a weird process, but it was really interesting to see what I have written actually fitting how I see international relations, but how I think about utopias and dystopias. So maybe I give, a little overview what my story is about. So what actually happens, the United Nations develop further, and then we have the United Nations and corporations, because corporations grew so powerful. What we actually see right now. And there were also global upheavals due to climate change and all the negative consequences and ramifications. And then there was a shift in paradigm So we are not talking about development anymore, but about well-being. And then there were some major technological leaps towards quantum computing. So now it is actually possible with very powerful computer programs to have an algorithmic policy making towards well-being. So actually international relations is automized, and the world then in 2122, 23, the world then looks really better. I mean, there is no poverty anymore. People live in good health until old age. And the world actually looks like a good place, or I mean, not necessarily a bad place, but also then there are voices criticizing what's happening. You know that those algorithmic policy making systems are still biased. I mean, there is kind of a colonization of Mars where there is an endless war. There is a virtual reality called the Sphere. So, you know, the metaverse wasn't very successful. So now we have the Sphere. And there are also happening strange things. And this is, you know, what it is about. So, in fact, it is always a bit of a struggle to do better. I didn't want to write it in a cynical way, like, okay, now we have a perfect world, you know, but in fact, it's still fucked up. This was not what I wanted to write. I wanted to write it in a way, you know, we try to do better, and then we still find problems and people are criticizing it. And then you need again to do kind of better. And of course, this is now my interpretation. Now the story is out and people can interpret it in their way. But this is a concept I'm also doing research on right now, which I call anti-dystopian. And I borrowed the term from Kim Stanley Robinson, who defined his book Ministry for the Future as anti-dystopian. And you know, when I wrote the story, I mean, the book Ministry for the Future wasn't out yet. So, but you know, there are maybe some vibes around in that direction. And I really can identify myself with that. An anti-dystopian means, you know, that the future is not necessarily going to be bad. You need to resist against those dystopian narratives that are all around us. And maybe, you know, utopia is also maybe even not reachable because it is maybe against human nature and it has this kind of totalitarian spark in it. And maybe we won't reach utopia actually, but anti-dystopian as a thinking, like, yeah, stresses the struggle we have all the time for the better. And then we find new challenges and we need to do better again. So maybe one more example, what I think is quite fittingly also is Ursula Le Guin's Dispossessed, because there she has these two different societies, you know, one, I call it now socialist maybe, the other one super capitalist. And, you know, she finds the problems in each society. And also the socialist society is not really utopian. They also have their problems, but she's also not cynical. It's a way to describe that we always need to fight against certain power structures, to fight the negative that might arise. And yeah, this permanent challenge to have a better future, I find quite interesting.
Laura, the chapter of Isabella is only one example because very diverse futures coexist in the volume. For example, in the chapter that I wrote, I imagined a future where the very much debated concept of decoupling of the global economy is set to the extremes, and there are multiple separated global economies which coexist within the same planet. And there is a weird reconfiguration of the concept of citizenship, which is closer to a Netflix subscription than the current way of interpreting it. That is to say that you had the daunting task to bind together a multiverse of world buildings and scenarios while editing the book. Which were the most striking future imaginations which you encountered, and how did you manage to make this common thread that you were discussing before within the conceptual frame that you described?
Yes, I love your chapter, Giuseppe. I think it's a brilliant, creative, but also at the same time immensely knowledgeable interpretation of previous historical trends, as well as bringing in kind of theoretical assumptions, for instance, your twist on Immanuel Wallerstein's work. And that's really also what makes this book particularly strong, because, of course, yes, it is academic science fiction, but it is not just science fiction to the extent that there's world building, but it's done against the expectations and also the limits, and sort of transgresses the limits of some of these academic discourses. I think what I want to link up with is Isabella, who mentioned Stan Robinson's work, which I think is a good, at the same time, reference point, but also something that we maybe go beyond in our work, in our future imaginations. Because yes, there's a whole spectrum of them. Some are hopeful, right? Some are sort of set against a background where there's been cataclysms, whether they come from a global pandemic or whether they come from ecological destruction, but then other things emerge. So we do have those futures. We also do have futures that are much more clearly dystopian. And I think that's also something that really sets this book apart, because there's no one common commitment to one future or the other. So you can really pick and mix if you wanted, but you have to work your way around it in order to sort of get to some of these other futures. The common thread, yes, it's the multiverse. The common thread is the commitment to thinking futures in ways that do not fully do away with existing human condition, to not do away with the Anthropocene condition that we're all facing, right? So, for instance, we did not allow our authors to bring in aliens. We did not allow our authors to just settle for mass colonization, as you now have some people sort of, try to evade the problems that we have by go long term. We thought that was problematic. So the emancipation that we seek always comes set against the conditions that humanity faces on this planet as we speak. Some of the chapters that I was particularly happy to follow include, for instance, the nuclear proliferation chapter that Michal Ondertko and Jeffrey Knopf have written. And it's a classical nuclear apocalypse, if you want, but with a twist. We also have a wonderful chapter that was quite prescient, if we talk about, policy and foresight. Maria Ferreira from Lisbon has written a chapter about a global pandemic before COVID. And then when the COVID pandemic came in, she rewrote her chapter and made it even scarier. We also have a wonderful, fantastic, and essentially evil chapter on eugenics, and how eugenics and genosocial hygiene become a policy tool against migration, written by Jakub Zahora, which will make you, sick to the stomach if you read it. And that's also a power of science fiction. That's the power of writing a book like this. There can be emotional resonances that you might not feel when you read any academic book about, for instance, racialized discourses in migration management. You might read this as a very neutral, this is what happens, and then we have this and this. If you read academic science fiction, you almost cannot read it without being bothered by it. So to that extent, there's a whole lot of resonances that come out of these future imaginaries. We might have wanted, and this is maybe something that we can think about for future projects, we would have really liked to bring in more political economy and economics. So, Giuseppe, looking at you here, that's something that we can explore, because there is also in academia and political economy, also a little bit in economics, and engagement with future expectations and the future imaginaries that drive our contemporary economics discussion. And I think there's a real need to go into this intersection between science fiction on the one hand, future imaginaries, but also the openness that we need in order to reconfigure, set free, emancipate our current economic structures, so that they indeed can be open for futures that are uncertain and that are in no way foreclosed as we like to assume them.
Absolutely. And this brings me to my next question. We are going towards the end of this episode, but I think this is a very important element within this whole project that we've been putting forward, which is, on the one hand, how science fiction can be used in academia. You mentioned the theoretical depth of this book, but also, on the other hand, the political activism side of this and the policymaking tool that such kind of exercise can bring. So how can we explain to our listeners a little bit further about this intention that we had since the beginning of really putting this out there as a new thing in order to serve, to be useful for those two purposes? I don't know if Isabella wants to chip in first, and then I'll get Laura to feedback on that.
What I think, Laura, you mentioned that before, right? When you described the contents of the story and how different they are. I think science fiction is a mirror, or let's say more projection canvas, where you can develop your thoughts further. And when you have this academic writing in your journal article, you cannot really play around much. I mean, maybe you can play a little around, but in this book, you could really have your own projection of the future and develop it further. And it needs to be a bit plausible, right? As Laura described. So there are no aliens and, we are not in deep time kind of colonizing the universe, but you are not so much bound by this regime of plausibility. And I think this is also a problem when you're doing foresight, that you're in this kind of plausible tunnel, or like this is a possible future or plausible future. And I think this doesn't really take us further because the future is not linear. I mean, when we look at the past now and how the future became, or the futures in plural, it's not plausible. And I think this is really a way to learn or to engage with future thinking, or maybe talk about futures literacy also. So when we talk about activism, I think it's really important to widen your thoughts about the future. And then you might think differently. What is there to come and what could happen? So maybe this is more an indirect activism, but just, open your mind to be open to new possibilities, and that there might be a change, or there might be a possible different future. So that's my take on that, to evade like this tunnel, this plausibility tunnel, and to think a bit more broadly.
Laura?
Absolutely. At the same time, just to continue that thread that Isabella has already sort of started on opening the future, just having this conversation also makes us aware of the politics and the power relations of the future, right? So we've seen, for instance, with the institutionalized process on the Conference on the Future of Europe, how difficult it is to actually make sure that voices are being heard, and whose voices count more, and what happens with the results. So who gets to write futures? It's a crucial question, and it becomes a question of method. And that is also something that Franziska and Aishem and I, as editors of the book, really want to bring into our discipline, is that we need to see the future as method, because it opens up epistemology's ways of knowing that might have been foreclosed in the politics of disciplines, but also the politics and just everyday functioning of policy making. Future making workshops here can be a brilliant tool also to open up ways of thinking about instruments, possibilities that go beyond the tunnel of plausibility. I love that term, Isabella, that puts blinders on our eyes, so to speak. And really, I mean, we need it. The futures that we have right now are not desirable. If you look at the IPCC reports, those are not the futures we want. And of course, we can't just walk away from them, but we can mobilize all the creativity, the joyfulness, the collaboration that we have experienced in a project like this, and then translate it into something that becomes actionable, translate it into something that can inform policy, engender new ways of thinking policies, of working together. So that, I think, is where we can use the book as a platform to inspire new ways of thinking about how to deal with our futures.
And last question, because we are running out of time, but Laura, what's next, in the sense that now the book is out and the community of researchers and creative writers that have participated has been working on it, I think, for 3-4 years. We've been working on that. So that has been quite a process. And I think that there are some expectations for this not to be a one-off, but actually the beginning of something.
It's been amazing to see what kind of reception the book has had, both in academia, but also in science fiction communities and also by policymakers. It really shows that there's a need to bring these different constituencies together, because you'd be surprised how much emancipation and how much will to be part of social change there is within science fiction communities. They are out there, and I think it would be really interesting and relevant to work with them also from a policy perspective. Now, what we've heard from several from our contributors and others is that there's a lot of interest in continuing the project as it stands, maybe thinking about different thematic focuses. But we've also seen interest in terms of developing this further as, again, as a policy tool. So we will definitely follow up. And just as a kind of side remark, in the context of approaching people, would you like to contribute to the book? You'd be surprised how many people have a science fiction novel or even just a short story in their drawer, and they've never shown it to anyone. So it is amazing to see that writing science fiction, speculative fiction, any sort of fiction really, but for us here, science fiction, is something that a lot of people actually want to do or have already done. And I would encourage anyone to step forward, get in touch with us here, with Giuseppe or with us as the editors, to see what we can do about it. But also just contact the fanzine, contact your local science fiction convention, get your stuff out, because you'd be surprised how many people will enjoy reading your scenarios and want to actually hear about your futures.
Thank you, Laura and Isabella, for joining this conversation. We could discuss for much longer, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for this episode. And I would like to remind our listeners that, as usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. Laura, Isabella, thanks a lot for joining us, and thanks to our listeners for following us. Until next time, bye-bye.